We are on stolen land, and we're on land that has been under the care and protection of First Nations for more than 65,000 years. I'm on the country of the Jagera and Turrbal people, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I think as we talk about how we better regulate and protect the environment through the Queensland government, I think it's worth acknowledging that we have a long way to go in terms of acknowledging that custodianship and also embedding the knowledge and the expertise of First Nations in our regulatory processes so that the values we're protecting are values that we more deeply understand. Yeah, if we'll be discussing that further throughout the day, but I want to start with that acknowledgement. Listen, my job today is to open and close today's event. Most of the work has been done by an excellent group of people, and the key people who are sitting behind this forum about why Queensland needs an independent EPA are the folks you can see on the screen today. So it's Jason Lydiath from the Australian Conservation Foundation, Crystal Falconer from North Queensland Conservation Council, Peter Arndt from the Catholic Archdiocese, and until very recently, the Social Justice Committee, Executive Officer, Sheena Gilman from Protect the Bush Alliance, our wonderful lawyers, Revel Poynton and Molly O'Connor from EDO, who you hear from shortly, Daryl Ebenezer from QOC, Queensland Water and Land Clearers, Graham Bartram from NPAQ, the National Parks Association Queensland, and last but by no means least, Rel McCarthy, the wonderful liaison officer from Sunshine Coast Environment Council. So they're the people who've done all the work. I'm just the one who's introducing folks. What I'd like is for the rest of you, if you can make sure your name, if you can go in and rename yourself to have your name and your organisation in your Zoom chat, that'd be wonderful. And if you can post in chat the country you're on and yourself and the organisation, that'd be really great, just so we know who everyone is and where you connect in. So the purpose of tonight's discussion, this discussion started with a whole lot of community organisations involved in QCC and outside of it who've been raising persistently issues of the failures of our environmental governance regime. And so we brought together a campaign team that QCC is supporting that's actually looking at how do we address this environmental governance and what is the opportunity with the upcoming Environmental Protection Agency, Independent Protection Agency that the Queensland government is proposing. So really, we've got 4 goals tonight. We want to provide an understanding to everyone present of how an independent EPA could make a difference to you and to your groups in terms of protecting the environment. We also want to invite everyone to identify how the local fights and struggles that get you furious about damage and impact you see on the environment could be impacted, hopefully in a positive way, but could be impacted by this proposed Environmental Protection Agency, and particularly how similar occurrences, you know, even if it'll be too late to kind of intervene, how these kind of systemic patterns of lack of environmental protection could be changed if we have an EPA. We want to explain the plan that the campaign team has pulled together and encourage groups to actively advocate for an independent EPA. And we're going to roll out some ideas around actions that we could do. And then what we also want to do is listen. We want to hear and gather more stories of the local issues that would be relevant for an EPA and any questions or concerns that you think are important in relation to the campaign that we can follow up. So they're the 4 goals: provide an understanding, invite members to see how it could connect, explain the plan, and then collect issues and stories. So what I'm going to do next is actually we're going to start off with our first poll of the evening, which is just really to test people's baseline. So firstly, how confident right now would you feel contacting your local MP about why we need an independent environmental protection agency? So that poll's going to pop up. There we go. I'm going to say super confident, but feel free to say what you'd like. Don't mean to weight the balance. Great. And while you're filling that out, not to distract you, but I believe we can multitask a little bit. Throughout tonight, I would encourage people to whack questions that you have, as Annie Hitchcock, I think, has already started doing in the chat. And and we will note these questions and we'll bring them up in the question and answer session later on tonight. So you don't have to hold it in your head. You can put it in there. But there's the results. And we've got a spread. I love that everyone's interested. There's a good selection bias there. But it's really clear that we're about a third in terms of where we're feeling in terms of raising that. So that's good to know. We've got our baseline data. Hopefully we can change those numbers. And listen, to do that, we're really lucky to have some very, very qualified people to do so. And the first that I'm going to invite to speak is Molly O'Connor. Now, Molly O'Connor is a proud Quandalmuka woman. She is a lawyer with the Environmental Defenders Organisation, and she is the co-author of an excellent report that the EDO produced around what key elements should be in independent environmental protection agencies across Australia, which I would thoroughly recommend to people. I'm sure we'll be sharing the links for that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Molly to explain what is an EPA.
Thanks so much, Dave, and just confirm you can hear me. I'll assume, yeah, perfect, awesome. So yeah, I'd also like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you tonight from Gumbaynggirr country, and I'd like to pay my respects to the Gumbaynggirr people and the elders past, present and emerging. So as Dave said, I'm a Quandalmuka woman from Minjerribah on Stradbroke Island, and I'm also a solicitor at the EDO and have been for just over a year now. And tonight I'm going to be talking to you about the proposal for an EPA in Queensland and what we want to see from this proposed reform. So as you're probably all aware, Queensland is currently the only state in Australia that does not have an Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. The Department of Environment and Science, or DES, is the current environmental regulator and is responsible for managing and monitoring environmental risks through a range of assessment, investigation, compliance, and enforcement activities. So the Queensland government is currently investigating the necessity of an EPA for Queensland, and that's primarily for the purpose of strengthening Queensland's environmental governance, enhancing independence and accountability, and increasing public confidence in the integrity and effectiveness of the environmental regulator. So as you probably know, in May this year, a discussion paper was released by the Queensland government, and it set out the different options that are being considered for an EPA in Queensland. And for those that sort of aren't aware of that discussion paper, I'm sort of going to go through it a little bit about what they're proposing. So there are 3 structures that are being considered for an EPA for Queensland. Firstly, rebranding the regulatory division of DES as an EPA. Secondly, establishing a statutory authority with or without a board. And thirdly, establishing a statutory body with or without a board. So if we were to, if the Queensland government was to choose the first option, then the Environmental Services Regulation Division of DES would merely be renamed as an EPA. So this wouldn't really provide any improvements to environmental regulation other than perhaps increasing brand awareness of what the regulator does. If the second option was chosen, then the EPA would be established as a statutory authority. A statutory authority is a separate legal entity. It's established under legislation, which means that the EPA would be separate from DES for operational purposes. However, it would sort of still be considered part of DES for financial accountability purposes. And the EPA would ultimately be accountable to the responsible Minister for the Environment. So if the third option was chosen, then the EPA would be established as a statutory body. And so a statutory body is a separate legal entity, also established under its own legislation, but it's different from a statutory authority because it's responsible for controlling its own funds. It's sort of considered very separate from DES in terms of financial accountability. But it would also still be accountable ultimately to the responsible minister, the Minister for the Environment. And as you can see, both the statutory authority and the statutory body can be established with a board or without a board. And I guess the benefit of a board is that it would provide an expert panel to oversee the operations of the EPA and to enhance its strategic direction. And so I guess we're of the opinion that if a statutory authority or body was chosen as a structure, that it should have a board that's appointed with people from broad areas relevant to environmental regulation. So it should include First Nations peoples, it should include scientists, and it should include people with regulatory expertise. And we think it's really important that those board appointments aren't from industry so that conflicts of interest are avoided and we can avoid that regulatory capture. And as many of you are aware, EDO did assist a number of QCC member groups, I think about a month or two ago, to put in a joint submission in response to the discussion paper. And so in that submission, we raised concerns about the discussion paper, especially the fact that it doesn't really address a lot of the serious and real issues that currently exist in environmental regulation in Queensland, or that I'm sure many of you have experienced. So we're sort of quite concerned that significant resources are being invested into investigating this EPA for Queensland. And I guess that, if we're going to be reforming environmental regulation, we should use this opportunity to actually improve the issues that we're all facing, rather than just, sort of, especially with that first option, just sort of rebranding DES and, giving it a new name without actually fixing the key issues. So by way of summary of those key issues that we were really concerned about, I'll go through them now. So firstly, we were concerned that there is inadequate representation and protection of First Nations interests currently in terms of environmental regulation. Secondly, we're really concerned about the weak role that DES currently plays in environmental decision-making, where you may know that it can be quite easily overridden by SARA or the Coordinator General in terms of some of its decisions. We're also concerned about regulatory capture, inadequate resourcing, of course, and also a lack of clear long-term environmental goals for Queensland, which are also going to be enforceable, which we think is important to sort of underpin this sort of environmental regulation. And so, as for those of you that were involved in that joint submission, you'll know that we made 3 key asks, which are up on the slides. So those 3 key asks for an EPA were, firstly, that First Nations justice is a central focus of environmental governance, and that First Nations interests are meaningfully represented in decision-making that affects them. Secondly, we were asking that the EPA should be an empowered, sufficiently resourced, science-led environmental regulator, which is independent of ministerial and industry influence, and which isn't going to be overridden by those other agencies like SARA or the Coordinator General. And then thirdly, we were asking that there should be consistent decision-making across all government agencies in order to meet those key environmental targets, which we think should be introduced and which the EPA should be empowered to enforce. So I guess by way of summary, essentially what we were asking in that joint submission is for an EPA that will actually improve environmental regulation for the benefit of both the environment and the people of Queensland. So yeah, thank you so much for listening to my sort of brief summary of EPAs in Queensland. And I'll now pass over to Steve McDonald, who's going to be sharing a local story about Redlands 2030 to sort of give you some context to some of these issues. Thanks.
Just checking if we got Steve, and if so, is he on mute?
I cannot find Steve when I search participants.
Can I recommend maybe if Lee's ready to jump in while I go search for Steve? Is that possible?
I can do that. Can you hear me?
Can, certainly, Lee.
All right. Well, I'll crack on with it. Start off the title, and then I've interpreted it this way. I've gone the story of a gutless paper tiger with no teeth. The recent Star Casino fiasco is a good example of industry capture and control of government in the gaming industry. However, blatant disregard for the law, failure to meet legislative requirements, and impotent and inadequate administrative government bodies are not restricted to the gaming industry alone. All of these problems are clearly evident across multiple industries that are managed by the Department of Environment and Science, or DES. So how does the rubber hit the road for regional conservation councils and the community at large? Let me take you on a 5-minute potted history of the Darling Downs Environment Council's experience in dealing with DES on compliance and regulation issues. DDEC formed in 2014 when the Liberal Newman government was in power. The DES was known as the DEHP, and Andrew Powell was the Minister for the Environment. This is when I first attended the Ministers' Round Table. At that meeting, I put it to the Minister that the coal seam gas industry is essentially deregulated, unmonitored and non-compliant. Unfortunately, this has proven to be true. And since 2014, DES has been unable to prove that they are up to the task across many industries, not just CSG. But we'll start with CSG, and then I'll move on to some examples from the mining and beef industry. At the same meeting in 2014, DDEC raised the issue of treatment and disposal of CSG industry-produced saline waste. After repeatedly raising the issue from then till now, we're now in the position of seeing an industry-friendly draft policy being put forward by DES. Community input to the process was tokenistic at best and primarily used as a box-ticking exercise for the department. Box-ticking is the DES's speciality. Transparency, document control, community involvement and data availability are not their strong points. The 2020 Queensland Audit Office report into DES's management of CSG could only conclude that there was limited assurance that the industry was compliant in any way. The reason given for the result in the report was that DES was unable to supply a big enough sample of data for the Audit Office to conclude any other way. This is telling and not just restricted to the CSG industry. As a whole, CSG activities are primarily code accessible, meaning applications are processed by the DES if the paperwork is correctly filled in. There is no other scrutiny. Other stakeholders, such as the community, are not consulted and have little or no way to engage in the process. On the odd occasions that the community is consulted, a lengthy, convoluted process is usually the result. This is happening right now with Arrow's application to drill 160 CSG wells. Sorry, 128. They downgraded it a couple of months ago. And this is on a lease adjacent to the contaminated Link Energy CSG prototype site. Now that's a whole other story that Queenslanders are going to have to pick up the tab for. Now, I just lost my spot there for a while. But anyway, in regard to the Arrow complaint, last week I received an email from the DES explaining the decision has yet again been delayed. But this has been going on for over a year now. And the DES is secretly or clandestinely meeting with Arrow to try and help them come up with a decent or acceptable proposal. On the other hand, we in the community and citizens at large have no such luxuries and must respond to submissions to the DES within tight and strict deadlines. This is a how long is a piece of string response time from DES extends to the complaint process. A complaint made about illegal mining at the New Ackland mine 5 years ago is still live. An inadequate response from the DES earlier this year to issue an enforceable understanding is currently under review by an ex-Land Court judge. Perhaps more telling, though, were the reasons DES gave for making such an insipid decision in the first place. The reasons included to avoid costly and lengthy legal proceedings, that the activity has since ceased. Of course it has, it happened over 5 years ago, and probably more significantly, an admission that the proposed solution was in fact put forward by the New Hope Group, the owners of the mine. This is the tail wagging the dog. Same mine has been issued minimal fines for drilling 27 illegal bores, about $3,300 they copped for that, and $9,000 for consistent noise level breaches. All of these cases have taken an extraordinary effort from the Oki Coal Action Alliance to make DES act at all, And in the case of the noise level breaches, Oki Coal Action Alliance had to spend $15,000 to get enough expert evidence to convince the DES to issue New Hope a $9,000 fine. Currently, I'm trying to help a local farmer with water contamination issues. In June, Des ran tests on his land that confirmed the contamination, and we both lodged a complaint. We're now still waiting for a response from DES, but neither of us have had any correspondence from the department. About 2 weeks ago, he called me to tell me he'd just buried 6 calves. 2 were stillborn, 2 were born blind and deformed, and the 2 others lasted little more than an hour. There is a real cost for DES in action. Now, to lighten the mood a bit, the ever-changing goalposts of environmental
Thank you, Lee.
authority.
We're almost ready to wrap up. You got a couple more minutes?
I've got a little bit to go. I won't be long. I can do a minute. Whenever breaches to EAs are accidentally discovered, I can validate this, I don't have the time. They can simply be ameliorated by adapting the EA to accommodate the level of the breach or completely remove the condition altogether. A 10-year-old Santos EA has been amended over 20 times. There is no document control around the process, and EAs are simply changed to reflect the new conditions and old ones just disappear. EAs are not recorded on the public, breaches are not recorded on the public register, and therefore proprietors that hold EAs can appear to be compliant when they're not. What all this shows is that DES does not see or treat the community as a legitimate stakeholder, that DES's current compliance regime amounts to little more than a tick and flick exercise, and that DES has little to no evidence to prove that what they're doing in the area of regulation, compliance and monitoring actually works. This is why we need a strong and independent environmental protection agency. I'll finish up there and pass on to Steve. Thanks.
Thanks, Lee. And you're right. So we're going to hold the Q&As. That's a great indictment. So I appreciate it, Lee. And we're going to hand over to Steve McDonald from Redlands 2030.
Thank you, Dave. Sorry, I'm late. Got preoccupied a bit with some follow-up on the EIS for Toondah Harbour, which is now, since I've last spoken about this in QCC, the EIS has been released for public comment. It actually is a monster of an EIS. Anyway, it's a monster of an EIS, about 5,200 pages as far as we can make out. It would take, our estimate is to take you nearly 40 days to read it. And the consultation period is for 40 days, or now down to about 35 days. It is huge. But and I know this is not in terms of directly environmental impacts or environmental permits, but there's been no advocate from anywhere from the public sphere on the environmental planning that's occurred for this whole process. And we haven't even seen anyone from the public sphere, being state government or local government, who have even made submissions on the construction of the EPA. I just have to close the door, sorry. That's better. My wife's on the phone, somebody else. So there's been no public authority who's made a submission at the EIS guideline stage, and I suspect none will be made now, to actually even constrain the EIS that's being done by the proponent, mainly because the proponent is in a development partnership with the local council and with the state government itself. So that there's no independence at all in terms of that process, and effectively they've abrogated their responsibilities to the public interest, they say, to the community organisations that are around. And certainly we've got some great support on that from, say, BirdLife and ACF in particular. But there's no assessment of the EIS by the state government in any way, shape or form at this stage, and unlikely to be, as we understand. So in my previous life, I worked in New South Wales with the EPA down there on the peripheral, and they would challenge the state agencies, particularly the agency I work for, and there's no equivalent here. And our big concern is that this development, once it proceeds through the EIS phase, is then going to be an application to the Coordinator General through the Economic Development Queensland. And we have little faith in EDQ and the Coordinator General improving the environmental outcomes of this development. The development itself sits in Moreton Bay, and on that picture there, the shoreline is about, on the bottom part of the picture, you can see the ferry terminals. That shoreline actually is about halfway through those terminals. You can see there, not where the boats are, but further in, heading north, and you can see a little beach up there, which is a recreation of something sort of bit in the quotation sense. So most of the 90% of the development is in Moreton Bay. It's in the Ramsar declared area. It's in the marine park. It's outside the urban footprint of the SCQ regional plan. So many of the plans and policies of the state government have been completely abrogated by this process. There's a small colony of koalas which live in the area. They're a matter of national significance, so they get an elevated roadway on that main east-west road. You can see there's some dark trees, about a third of the way down towards the water. And that's an elevated underpass for the koalas that's going to be there. The road to the north coming through the parkland, that's a recent addition. And so the park that's there will be totally severed from the waterfront. The waterfront will be a marina, which will include defouling paint and so forth. So it's probably going to be unswimmable. And so it's 3,600 apartments in Moreton Bay. This is about 50 to 60% the size of Cleveland itself. Cleveland is about 1.5 kilometres to the west of this site. It's a mammoth development. It'll be the most dense development in southeast Queensland, except for some of those inner suburbs along the river, Kangaroo Point, etc. So we're creating a hugely, highly densified urban development on the fringes of Brisbane, being in the waters of Moreton Bay, and the government has basically abrogated any input into this development and left the decision making to the Coordinator General. One of the gems of the Economic Development Act is that the development has been through a consultation phase, which, by the way, the consultation phase involved development. You can mainly see the park on the top left-hand corner with the cricket pitch and so forth. The original consultation involved 800 units in that location, west of that north-south road. And when the development came out in the EIS phase, it's 3,600 apartments to the east of that development. So the consultation didn't even involve this land. I know perhaps it's not the core business of an environmental protection authority, but in Queensland we have, as I understand, the most powerful public servant in Australia is the Queensland Coordinator General. So he determines the outcomes of this. They measure their performance by approvals. I don't think they even count refusals. So it's all about approvals. Consultation has finished, and there's no appeals on this development under the Economic Development Act. The Sekisui decision recently indicates that sometimes appeals work, but in this case there is no appeal because the consultation period, even though it involved a different location, has closed. And so after that there's no further required consultation under the Queensland legislation. The only thing that triggered this involvement in the EIS is because the development fell into the water, which happened to be Commonwealth, trigger the Commonwealth EPBC Act. So from just in terms of planning processes, it's actually pathetic. It's an abrogation of responsibilities by the state government, in my view, anyway.
Thanks, Steve. Just one more minute to wrap up, if that's all right.
Yeah, well, I'm just make the point that in my view, there's no independent, even the Department of Environment were not involved in the conceptualising of this. It was all under the then Economic Development Queensland, whose minister was the Minister Sini, who basically refused to listen to any other points of view. But it is a step back into the sort of white shoe brigade planning that we've seen lead to lots of problems up and down the coast. It could only happen in Queensland. It would not got a Guernsey in New South Wales, Victoria or Tasmania. So that's what we get out of what we've got now, the framework we've got now. So an independent EPA at least might be able to counter the power of the Economic Development Act and the Economic and the Coordinator General, and there's many other, I guess, strange outcomes of it being delivered through this. And it is a massive, the land, by the way, is worth probably $360 million. And it's in some hidden process. We can't see that. It's a development agreement. It's a secret, but it actually probably is being given to Walker Corporation at the end of the process. At the end of the process, yeah, the land will be given away to the proponent. So there are lots and lots of questions about the due process, but certainly lots of questions about the environmental outcomes here, including the threats to the Ramsar area, the koalas and the migratory birds that frequent the area. They're matters of national environmental significance, but just general environmental issues are just totally disregarded in this process.
Yeah, no, thank you, Steve. So appreciate that. So there too, I mean, for many of you may have some knowledge of these examples, but I think one of the things we wanted to do is just lift up where our environmental governance laws are broken at the moment, and to give two really clear examples that are current, but also that we've had strong local advocacy on. Like, the one thing you can't say in either of these cases is that there hasn't been strong community opposition. There has been strong, persistent and sustained, and yet our laws still haven't delivered the outcomes that we need. So next I'm going to hand over to Jen Ackland. I think we're off into breakout rooms. So Jen, can you explain what people are going to do there?
Yeah, I sure can, Dave. Thank you. So in a minute, Maggie's going to put us in breakout rooms. We want to have a conversation in breakout rooms. There'll be 3 questions with a 4th question optional. And the purpose of this is to flush out some of the questions that you have, and we'll come back to Q&A afterwards. The first question, if I could just get the slides in, if someone could please put the slides in the chat, that'd be great. Oh, there they are. The questions are there. Thank you so much. So make sure we capture who your group is so that we can follow your name and your group so that we can follow you up. First question is about what your local issue is, where an independent EPA could make a difference, because as Dave said, this the campaign team feels that one of the key ways of making a difference in this campaign is to lift up what those local issues are of the system that is broken. So we want to know your local issue, firstly. Secondly, what questions do you have about how this could make a difference? And thirdly, if we have time, really keen to hear how you're currently getting your message out about your local fight and what kind of materials might help connected to an EPA so that we as a campaign team can produce them. So those questions will be in the breakout room for you.
Sorry, I've just realised something, Jen. We're meant to go to Revel first, aren't we? And to talk about the difference in EPA can meet and then go to the breakout rooms? Or we're going to do the breakout rooms and then come back? Okay, so sorry, that's what you're going to be talking about next?
Sorry,
so
Dave.
That's it. No, that's okay. I got confused on the run sheet. But before we do that, we've given you the problem. Now let's talk about a bit of the solution, and we're going to hand over to Revel Poynton from the EDO, and then you're going to go and have those discussions.
Thanks, Dave and Jen. Nice to see you all on here. It's a pleasure to join you from Gumbaynggirr country down in Coffs Harbour at the moment. I hope my reception is okay. Sorry if it's spotty.
So far, so good.
Awesome. So as you have heard eloquently described by Steve and Lee, and as many of you know, we're currently suffering from incredibly poor environmental governance that's not supporting sustainable outcomes nor accountable decision-making in Queensland. We've got a mining company that's got away with developing a whole mine pit, impacting local residents and the environment for years and only being required to do slightly better rehab. Taken Des 4 years to get to there. And Toondah, we see a massive private development on Ramsar listed wetland, protected under international conventions, federal laws, and yet being subject to extremely limited environmental assessment at the state level, where the state is typically the key environmental assessor and very limited public accountability. So these are the real issues that Queensland's facing. And at the moment, the consultation being undertaken by the Queensland government on the EPA doesn't tackle these issues. But what we do have right now is from the Queensland government actually committing to looking at whether we should have an EPA is a really prime opportunity to raise the relevance of the issues that we see on the ground every day that Queensland's facing, that's leading to poor environmental outcomes through the work of DES and the failures of Queensland environmental decision-making processes, and then pointing to, from those issues, these are the changes we need to see through the work going on to get an EPA. And that can mean more independence, and a lot of this Molly set out in terms of more independence from the things that the entities that actually are overriding DES, where in Queensland, the DES entity is one of the most independent from ministerial influence, as in the Environment Minister, than any other EPA in Australia. But where our environmental regulator is suffering is from being overridden by the Coordinator-General, by SARA, and just not being sufficiently resourced to actually do its job well and enforce the laws. And obviously a lot of that comes from regulatory capture. So by using this opportunity now to highlight regulatory capture, the role of the Coordinator-General and SARA in overriding DES's interests, we can create more awareness of the need for DES, or the new EPA, to actually be adequately resourced to do their work, independent of these development-centred agencies, and with effective mechanisms put in place to ensure that they're actually not subject to regulatory capture anymore. And it's these fundamental issues being raised through this. Sorry, yeah, thanks, Dave. Poor use of acronyms. So that's in the Department of Planning, the entity that does a lot of the local government-related urban development. When I say SARA, apologies for that. So yeah, what we have right now is an opportunity to get us beyond status quo. Worst case outcome from this whole campaign would be that we just get DES as a rebranded EPA with no change whatsoever, and that we just back in the government getting all of the credit for just slapping a new name on DES's front door. Best case though is that we use this to really highlight what are the local issues on the ground that we're facing, getting them in the media, getting them into your advocacy to ministers, and then actually getting real change that leads to an EPA that is truly independent, is science-led, and has a mandate to put environmental decision-making first, and isn't overridden by industry interests or other development-centred interests. And it's going to be hard work. Entities like the Coordinator-General are incredibly powerful in Queensland, but we've got to do the work. We did have a DES with a concurrence agency power that I know that a lot of you are aware what that means. Very strong power in planning decision-making, and with enough campaign pressure, we can get that back. And along with all of the good things that we need an EPA to have in Queensland. So I'm not sure how we went for time, but maybe I'll leave it there and we can come back to any more discussion afterwards.
No, that's great. Thanks, Raoul. And so now the long-awaited and foreshadowed breakout rooms. So you've got the 4 questions. Please share the time, share your name, your group, the local issue that an EPA could make a difference on, how you think it could help, and any questions you have. Welcome back, everyone. And I think so Jason Lydiath is taking over this next section of he will be the person helping answer your questions.
Well, I don't think I'll be doing any of the question answering. Rather, I'll moderate this section. So what I'll do is I'll go through groups one by one and see what questions came out, and then ask someone who might have an answer if they can answer. Dave, you're in group 1. Could you or someone maybe give us a bit of a report back and let us know if you've got any questions?
Listen, the thing that came up from us was a lot around urban development as one of the factors that we saw often by councils with very little state action. And the question we had was, like, obviously we an independent body with a board sounds good, but how do we make sure the board isn't stacked or easily politicised?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure who would be the best person to answer that. Would that maybe be something that the EDA could answer, something that we could actually write into the Act or into law?
Yeah, for sure. It's the same question our group had, actually, of how do we ensure that any board or a statutory entity with leadership is independent. And I think at the end of the day, you having defined roles in the legislation of the kinds of people that should fill those roles, such as they're diverse, but focused on like environmental regulation, environmental protection, science, First Nations interests, compliance, even those kinds of entities as defined roles. So you're not just picking, industry bureaucratic kind of people to fill board roles. And the other key element of it is actually preventing very strong legislative requirements around conflicts of interest being avoided, so that you, as soon as you're not appointed, if you would have a conflict of interest around an industry entity, and also if one came up, that you immediately stood back from the decision making or stood down from the position. So, but keen to hear if anybody's got other thoughts on how to ensure it.
Well, that sounds pretty good, and probably something we need across multiple boards and stuff in Queensland. It turns out that the chair of the Brisbane Olympics Organising Committee is also on the board of the world's biggest oil company. So how's that for you? Yeah, climate-friendly Olympics. Next up is Team 2, Jen Ackland's group. Jen, are you good to talk, or is someone else gonna?
I'll be real quick, and then the group can add transition to renewables. So the impact on agricultural land and the fact that they don't have to follow an EIS was one of the issues, and also the same issue about urban deforestation due to development, urban development, koalas, etc., not being mapped. The question was around how do we educate people about what the processes currently are, what the loopholes in the system are, and how we overcome them. Is there anything to add there, though, Jen and Sophie?
No.
You go first.
Jen.
You go first, Sophie.
I'm just worried with the current policies and processes in place. We're just skipping a lot of steps and going straight into putting renewables up and not worrying about the biodiversity that we're losing while we're doing it.
And I'd support that. It's a huge issue emerging here with regard to solar farms on prime agricultural land, and also wind turbines. 8,000 hectares have been lost apparently, and there was no whisper of it. We heard after it happened.
Dave, do you want to have a chat to that? Because it's something that we've definitely been talking about and thinking about recently.
On the issue of nature versus renewables. Yeah, okay. Listen, we're big fans of renewables. We're big fans of wind farms and solar, but they've got to be in the right place. And one of the problems we've had is we've had a lack of planning. And so what's happening is it's just up to private proponents to grab the land they can close to the infrastructure. What we're hoping will come out of the energy plan is actually a commitment to our planning process. And there's a document that's going to be launched tomorrow, which will actually map out some of the principles behind that. But principles are one thing. We need planning mechanisms to actually control that. And the code accessible mechanisms that sit there for the wind farms plan at the moment need to be reformed. So that we can actually make sure that where it's happening on areas that it shouldn't, that there's an ability for community opposition. And so that's going to be important. Kind of probably will happen simultaneous to this EPA, but it's important that going forward, I think where there is those problems, we need an agency, whether it's planning or the EPA, to actually make sure that their proper planning constraints are as there's new developments and new industries expand, because we've seen that be really damaging, whether it's wind farm or gas or everything. Often regulation follows very slowly after changes in the economy, and we need to be more reactive in advance.
Can I jump in very quickly as well? Is that okay? Sorry. We've actually been looking at this even at the conference, the thing I'm at the moment. We had a big session this morning on the impact of the renewable industry from a resource perspective. Like there's 40 to 70% more mining going to be required to meet our demands for renewables. It's massive and really polluting mines. So having an entity that will take environmental assessment seriously and being resourced to actually understand what a proponent is putting forward, question the integrity of that information and make the right decision is essential. And one of the key things we're wanting in an EPA, that it's resourced well and staffed by appropriate expertise to do the job. And one thing that's come up in previous discussions, which I think is an awesome idea, is that we push for the EPA to have be subject to more strategic planning, where they're actually they are the centre of environmental decision making in Queensland, that they're keeping an eye on what are our environmental issues we're facing at the moment, and how do we make decisions in a way that we're getting good outcomes and they're sensible. And yeah, as you were saying, Dave, that there's good planning going into where we put renewables, and also that we're picking up on the impacts of the particular mining that's required for renewables, and ensuring that it's done well. Like, it's simple stuff that a lot of it does come down to governance that can be improved through the EPA.
Yeah.
Thanks, Revel and Dave. I've been told I need to hurry this up. So fortunately, my group is the next group, and so I can be really quick on that. We had an awesome conversation. We had lucky enough to have Lee in our group, and so we just really talked about got to do extension on his great talk earlier. But the resourcing fact came up really heavily, and heard that from Darryl as well, that this is an ongoing theme. So I'll jump to number 4, which is Kim's team. Are you able to speak to this, Kim?
I was hoping Ingrid or Tom might be able to speak better to it.
Great.
I guess what we spoke about was the fact that DES has failed us dismally with the WildNet as a collective, with collecting species data and so forth. So, you know, there's not a lot of trust with DES to be able to manage anything else in the space if they can't. And so approvals are going to be approved if there's no platypus or koalas or cassowaries in that zone, because they've lost all our data. And the other thing that Tom mentioned was the fact that bonds aren't put in place, and the fact that when developments are given approval, that they're the rules and regulations around the developments are on a slippery slope in the process, and they're all wound back. So during the time of the EIS, so yeah. They can't be holding all the eggs in their basket and doing the approvals.
Yeah.
When they control the data and they lose it.
Yeah. Was there any questions, Ingrid?
Not that I remember. Hand over to Kim or Hannah or Tom. Yeah.
I might just keep it moving. It's Revel's group now. It sounded like maybe we'd already covered the thing. So unless someone in Revel's group wants to say something, I'll jump to the next group. Crystal.
Great. I will nail this question down because it was a bit bigger. How do other states' EPAs compare?
Oh, Rev, is this one you know about?
Yeah, that's it's a good question, but it's also a long question, if I'm honest, in terms of the very different entities in each state. and there's things to learn from all of them. And I am going to be honest, I should have reflected over our comparison before I came on tonight, because I'd like to be able to speak to this in more detail. But I know the Perth entity, for instance, has a board, and they can be quite independent, but and they put out great decisions and recommendations, really strong ones that were public, but they were then overridden by the minister's decision at the end of the day. And we see other entities where it depends if you're actually just siphoning off the statutory kind of assessment and enforcement role from policy, which is what I think one of the key drivers for the EPA in Queensland has been. That does occur in some states, and then in others, the EPA plays more of like a pollution. It's often the case that they're playing more of a pollution control kind of more refined process, and you do see a lot of decisions coming out of other entities around mining and urban development and whatnot, similar to how we have at the moment in Queensland. So yeah, as I said at the start, and my part, DES is actually in some ways better than a lot of EPAs, and including actually, even if I can say, around mining assessment, we're actually one of the few states that has merits-related appeal rights in the assessment of a lot of mining in Queensland, at least coal mining, and that doesn't exist everywhere. So there's things to be grateful for. Cool. And yep.
I'll just pull you up, because it does sound like that's a huge thing to get in. If we could maybe get some, a little bit of info out, that would be good. But it sounds in general that, there's pretty strong consensus across all these groups that we need a really strong, independent, well-resourced EPA, because at the moment, the lack of this is a real massive problem. Thank you, everyone, for that. I'm going to pass over to Crystal.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. And thanks, Jason. Hopefully everyone's brains have been given a lot to chew on so far. My name is Crystal, and I'm a member of the campaign team. Tonight I'm coming to you from the dry tropics of Burrenville Borough Townsville on Wulgurukaba and Bindal country. So hopefully now, after a little bit of discussion with each other, you're keen to understand how our campaign is travelling and where you and those local stories fit in. So I'm just going to take you through a pretty brief overview of what we've achieved so far, what's coming up, and importantly, how you can help. So for anyone who doesn't know, our campaign team formed about 5 months ago. And our first action was to dive into the EPA discussion paper, which was open for consultation back then. As Molly mentioned back at the start, our clever and very generous friends at the EDO drafted a fantastic submission, for which the campaign team were able to provide a bit of input. So this submission was then opened up to other groups, with the campaign team reaching out to our wider network, which was mostly you lot. And we managed to get 35 signatures on that joint submission, which I think was pretty impressive. It was a great launchpad for the campaign, and it allowed us to demonstrate to the state government that Queensland conservation groups know what we want. We're engaged on this issue, we're united on what we want, and we've set our sights on an EPA that can actually protect our environment. Our next move was to refine our messaging. Because as you can see, it's a pretty broad kind of complicated topic, and we had to draw it down into some simple and powerful messages, which we hope that will help anyone and everyone to understand what this opportunity is, what we want, and why it matters. So at this point, I'd like to acknowledge the invaluable support that we've received behind the scenes from Edwina, Kim, and Maggie, who is quite literally behind the scenes for us tonight. Campaign team has also been talking to other groups to build broader community support and identify opportunities for knowledge sharing or collaboration. One example is our engagement with the Labour Environment Action Network, or LEAN. Lean are actually currently taking active measures to push for the inclusion of the same kind of things that we want to see in an EPA. So working on this has been, working together on this, has been mutually beneficial. We've also been speaking to people within government to better understand the decision-making process and kind of just suss out the lay of the land. From these conversations, we've learned that the business case for an EPA will be taken to Cabinet sometime next month. Sometime, not sure when at this stage. But it does mean that we have a very small window of opportunity to ensure that those Cabinet ministers, they know that we're engaged and to know what we want. The plan is, this is the exciting bit, each one of us here writes to our local MP on behalf of our organisations with a powerful letter that clearly states what we expect in an EPA, why it matters to us, which is basically where those local stories come into play. So we have developed a template of the letter to make this a little bit easier for you, which of course you're free to edit and add to as you see fit. We've intentionally left a space there for you to add your own local story, which hopefully you've really started to tease out and think about tonight. Keep in mind what has been iterated earlier tonight, that local story could be the difference. It could be what stands out to your local MP and make it make sense. So we expect that you might like to start talking about this campaign with your members or your grassroots supporters, and we want to help you to do that. So to do that, we've developed a webpage with some of the messaging that I mentioned before that we've so thoughtfully crafted, because we know that websites they're just a great resource for all of your supporters. So instead of sending supporters to QCC's website, where that webpage currently is, we'd like to invite you to copy the content of the webpage and put it somewhere on your own website, if you have one. That way, your supporters will visit your website, they'll engage with your organisation, and they'll see that you are involved in this collaborative campaign. You can then make that webpage your own. So our messaging is just a guide to get you started, but it'd be great if you could include your local stories, your local imagery, etc. And it doesn't have to be a website, it could be a Facebook page or whatever you've got going on. If this is something that you'd like to do, but you don't currently have the time or perhaps the tech skills, we can help if you let us know that you need help. So after tonight, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the webpage and a link to the letter template, which we hope you'll zhuzh up and make your own and then send to your MP. We ask that you CC Jen into any emails that you send to your MP, so that we can track which MPs have been contacted about this. And of course, if you need any help with that letter, let us know. Remember, we want to get these letters out before the business case is taken to Cabinet next month. So the sooner you can get onto this, the better. And, you know, if you want to use this letter as an opportunity to request a meeting with your local MP, by all means, because it's nice to sometimes have an excuse to do that. We will be holding more online events in future because this is a statewide campaign. It's not just coming out of Brisbane, as I'm sure you've seen tonight. As more information comes to light, we want to be able to share that with you. And we also want to provide opportunities for you to invite your grassroots supporters along. So the next thing that we have planned is a legislative briefing from the wonderful Dave, which is planned for about 2 weeks' time. And that's open for anyone who might find it useful to get their head around some of that legislation and where we fit in. So we'll send out the details about this, don't worry. So in summary, the actions that you can take after tonight, if you choose to, which I hope you do, are write to your MP using our letter template if that's useful to you, and two, to incorporate the messaging from the webpage to your website to help engage your local supporters. The more people who get behind this campaign, the better. It's likely that there will be massive pushback against the kind of EPA that we want. After all, we know that environmental vandals are pretty happy with the status quo. So if we can demonstrate broad community support for a powerful independent EPA and deliver hard-hitting stories to as many MPs as possible, then we can influence the ultimate outcome. We're really excited to have you with us here tonight and hope that you will take something away from what you've heard or discussed here. But to test that, we have another quick poll just to gauge how confident you are now feeling about the next steps, in particular, taking this to your local MP. There's a poll time. Oh, there it is. Now, if you're thinking about selecting need help, please pop your details in the chat so that we can follow up with you, because we'd love to provide that help. Also, if you have any particular ideas about ways that you would like to be supported to carry out either of those actions, or perhaps how you can get a little bit more involved or learn a bit more about the campaign, please drop those ideas in the chat too. And while you're doing that, I'm going to hand you back over to Dave to wrap us up.
Thanks, Crystal. All right. So, I mean, one of the reasons why we know we need this campaign, and look, we've changed the numbers. We've already moved. We've done the first change that's necessary in any social change. We've moved ourselves. So we've built our knowledge about what we need to do to be able to take action. So that's great. Like, I actually think this group of people knows a lot about environmental issues. You guys are incredibly knowledgeable. You've got the local knowledge on the ground. What we're going to need to be able to win this, as well as that knowledge, is power. Because we've got a moment where we can push, because the legislative change of wheels will happen, and I'll brief more on that on a forum on the 3rd of November from 6 to 7. But that briefing's no good if we don't have the power. So I was asked to think about what kind of image we could all take together. So if everyone can turn their cameras on, and the image I want to do, because I've never done it before, is everyone remember the images of Rosie the Riveter? So we can do it. Okay, so what I want you to do is get your right or your left arm, and I want you to make them like muscle like this, and I want you to all pose and pull your sleeve back if you can, because we have the power, we can do it.
Right or left?
Either or. I'm not going to discriminate on the basis of people's handedness. All right, Jace, we're doing a screenshot. I want everyone bring the guns out. All right, good work, guys. Thank you so much. Is someone capturing this, Maggie? Are we good? Great. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for doing that. Bit different. You got to have some fun on your nights. But we'll also use that to show we're fired up and we're ready to go. Listen, I think that's kind of it. Just to acknowledge, Narelle, we did skip over some of the commentary on section 5, but I think we picked up the questions. Is that right?
Yes, most of those were things that were raised with Group 5, but one thing that did come out was about this devolution to local governments, that they're not resourced or skilled, or certainly haven't the political will, and also the independent EPA needs to have those long-term environmental goals. So similar to the 30 by 30 at the federal level as well. So that more coordination and independence.
Great. And listen, the last thing I'll say is, when we started this campaign, we knew it was going to be uphill. I think what's happening currently with the debates federally, you know, we've had a federal environment minister said she's going to oppose all new extinctions or trying to prevent all further extinctions, which is incredible, really hard to achieve, and not going to be able to achieve unless all 3 levels of government actually has environmental regulation that does what it says on the box. So we've got a moment now where the door is starting to open and we're going to have to push really hard, and it's great to have you all here for part of it. So thank you tonight. Go out into the action, but hopefully get those letters into the minister, get those examples locally about what matters, and then start sharing those stories and getting that up on your website. They're the call to action. So thank you very much for coming, but let's make sure that this isn't what we do. What we do is what happens afterwards. All right. And with that, I might wrap up there. Thank you and good night.